بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى باب الشهيد, the chapter of the martyr. الشهيد من قتله المشركون أو وجد في المعركة وبه أثر الجراحة أو قتله المسلمون ظلما ولم يجد بقتله الدية فيكفن ويصلى عليه. So before we begin with the book, know that when we use the word shaheed, there are actually two kinds of shaheed. الشهيد في حكم الآخرة فقط والشهيد في حكم الدنيا والآخرة. So there's kind of a shaheed who is considered to be a martyr in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which means he gets the same kind of ajr and the same kind of status in Allah ta'ala at the day of judgment. But as far as this world is concerned, the ahkam of normal people are going to be applied on that person. Then you have the kind of shaheed which is considered a martyr in this world and in the hereafter, right? So along with the status and the privilege that he's gonna get in the day of judgment, he or she also has some special ahkam relating to this world, right? So no ghusl, for example, that's one thing. And as far as their takfeen is concerned, their shrouding, they're given new clothes. They'll be shrouded within the same clothes they died in, etc. So the only difference between the two types of shaheed are in terms of their burial. While as far as their status in the Allah Ta'ala is concerned, and as far as the virtue that they will receive, they will be equal. So for example, in the famous hadith, the Prophet Islam mentioned the person who dies because of stomach pain is shaheed. The one who drowns is a shaheed. The one whose roof falls on him and he dies, he's shaheed. Right? So there are a lot of categories of people who are actually martyrs. For example, the woman who dies in pregnancy, she is shaheed. But these people will still be considered as normal human beings as far as this dunya is concerned. Right? But the ahkam and the day of judgment, that's different. When we talk about Babu Shaheed in the books of fiqh, we actually refer to the second kind of shaheed, which is a martyr in this world and the hereafter, because that is exactly what the fiqh is concerned with. It's not concerned with the events of the hereafter, it's more concerned with the practical purposes of this world. Now, with this distinction of the two types of martyrs in mind, Imam Quduri begins off giving you three examples of who could possibly be considered a martyr. So it's number one, the one who's been killed by a polytheist. Number two is someone who was found dead in the battlefield and he has wounds on him. Right? So your dominant assumption would be that he was killed. And third is someone who the Muslims themselves killed unjustly and no diya is due upon killing him. So the first thing is that in the third category, that that person was killed unjustly, because if it was for some reason, for example, that person had committed murder and now he's being put to death because of qisas, or because a married person committed adultery and they're being put to death, right? So this is not them being killed unjustly. This is due to one of the ahkam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So such a person would not be considered shaheed in this world. The other thing is, but diya is not due for his killing, right? Sometimes a Muslim might be killed, even at the hands of other Muslims, but qisas is not possible, right? For example, let's say in a Muslim neighborhood, a body is found dead, right? And you have all the indications that this person was murdered, stab wounds, gun wounds, or whatever, but you can't find out who actually murdered him. it's unknown. So obviously you can't just arbitrarily put qisas on some random person. You need proof of that. When you don't have proof, you go towards the diya. That whole neighborhood like has to pay the blood money for that person, right? So even though that person is now found dead, he won't be considered shaheed because uh, the diya is actually due on that person and not qisas. So any kind of uh, act of an example for that is like manslaughter. Like if some Muslim accidentally kills another Muslim or dhimmi, then there's no qisas. There's only blood money. There's only diya. So that kind of person who was killed mistakenly, he's also not considered a shaheed in the ahkam that we'll be discussing right now. Now, these are just examples of what a shaheed could possibly look like in this world. Now I'll tell you the zabta, or the rule through which you can determine whether or not a person will be considered a shaheed and the ahkam of shuhada will apply on him or not. So anyone who was killed with a weapon, like something that can actually kill, right? A sharp object, for example, an extremely heavy object. So any kind of tool which could normally be used for killing. So if that kind of tool has been used, number two, and this was done unjustly. Third condition is that person was in a state of purification. They were not in a state of janaba. Fourth is that that person must have been adult, must have reached puberty. And fifth condition is that there should be no iwaz mali. There should be no financial compensation for his death, initially at least. Initially, for killing that person, the other person, their punishment is the death penalty. If it so happens that the family of the deceased chooses to forgive that person or take blood money instead of qisas, that's another thing. But initially, there wasn't any financial compensation, there was no blood money. The punishment would have been qisas. So this is the fifth condition. And condition number six, and the last condition, is that there shouldn't be any irtifaf. Irtifaf means to actually benefit from life. That person who was wounded or he was attempted to be killed must not live long enough to be able to eat or drink or be able to be shifted to the hospital and maybe then he dies in the ER, or he was alive long enough that the time period of an entire salah passes. Like if irtifas is present, if this benefiting from life is present, then that person will not be considered as a martyr as far as the ahkam related to this world are concerned. So these are the six conditions. If you find them in a person, then that person will be considered as a martyr. Now, what are the ahkam for such people? Yukafan wa yusalla alayh. They will be shrouded and they will be prayed over. Wala yuksal or yuqassal. But they won't be given a ghusl, they won't be washed. Right? Some of the Aimma say that for Shaheed, you don't need any prayer because Salatul Janaza is basically a dua ul maghfirah. You're making a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive that person. And this Shahada itself was something that erased all of his sins. And so he no longer needs that dua, right? But the fact is that being pure of sins uh, does not necessarily uh, make you independent or not needing of dua. For example, children, uh, because they're not mukallaf, they don't have any sins, or the Anbiya alayhim salam, they don't have any sins, but you can still make dua for them. So making dua for someone who maybe does not have any sins on them that's okay. I mean, they're two different things, making the dua and having no sins. And so there's no point in not praying for the deceased, for the shuhada. And so the Prophet in Islam, he prayed for the shuhada, and Uhud is a very good example of that. All right. وإذا استشهد الجنب غسل عند أبي حنيفة رحمه الله تعالى وكذلك الصبي. When a junub, a person who was unable to actually purify themselves after having sexual intercourse, right? If they're killed, they're martyred, they will be given a ghusl. Normally, a shaheed wouldn't be, but if you remember, one of the conditions that I mentioned was that person should be in a state of purification. Because if they're not, they will be given the ghusl, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, as well as the minor. Because one of the conditions we also mentioned was that that person should be an adult. So a minor and a person in the state of janaba, they will be given ghusl according to Abu Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala, and that is on which we issued the fatwa. But according to the Sahibain, Abu Yusuf wa Muhammad rahimahullah ta'ala, لا يغسلان ولا يغسل عن الشهيد دمه. That those two people, because they're shuhada, they will not be given the ghusl, right? As far as Imam Abu Hanifa is concerned, he presents the case of Hanzala radiallahu anhu. He was newly married, and on the very next day, the call for Uhud was given out. And so he didn't even find the time to actually make a ghusl. And so he went and he was martyred. And what happened was that the Malaika came and gave him the ghusl. And so because of this, we know that if a person passes away in the battlefield, uh, in a state of janaba, they will be given a ghusl, right? وَلَا يُغْسَلْ عَنِ الشَّهِيدِ دَمُهُ. The shaheed's dam will not be washed away from his body. وَلَا يُنْزَوْ عَنْهُ ثِيَابُهُ. And neither will his clothes be removed from him. Except if it's something extra, right? For example, يُنْزَوْ عَنْهُ الْفَرْوُ وَالْحَشْفُ. His leather jacket, furs, boots, weapons, all of these things will be removed. So anything which like can act as a kafan, his clothes, there's no point in removing them. But anything extra that might be covering their bodies, that will be removed. So blood's not going to be removed. The reason being that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned زَمِّلُوهُمْ بِكُلُومِهِمْ وَدِمَائِهِمْ, that bury them with their wounds and their blood, and do not wash them, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be a witness of the state in which they left this world. Right? So because of that prophetic instruction, we will not remove the blood and we will not remove their clothes. So that's also one of those things that a shaheed has special for him, that he will be buried in the same clothes he passed away in, even though they're bloodied. وَمَنِ ارْتُثَّ غُسِّلَ. And whoever remains alive benefits from this world is to be given a ghusl. وَالْإِرْتِثَاث. Now he's defining what irtithaf means. أَن يَأْكُلْ وَيَشْرَبْ أَوْ يُدَاغَ. Remaining alive includes eating, drinking, being treated, medicated. أن يبقى حيا حتى يمضي عليه وقت صلاة. Remaining alive until the time of one prayer passes over him. وهو يعقل. With the condition that he's still conscious. أو ينقل من المعركة حيا, or he's transferred from the battlefield and he was still alive. So if any of these five things are present, this will be considered as irtifaf, and that person will no longer have the worldly ahkam of the martyr. وَمَنْ قُتِلَ فِي حَدٍّ أَوْ قِصَاصٍ. And whoever is killed due to a had, uh, a legally prescribed punishment, or qisas, or supervised retaliation, I, because of killing someone, غُسِّلَ, that person will be given a ghusl, وَصُلِّ عَلَيْهِ, and he will be prayed over. وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مِنَ الْبُغَاةِ أَوْ قُطَّاعِ الطَّرِيقِ لَمْ يُصَلَّ عَلَيْهِ. But if a rebel, someone who's going against the Muslim state, right, or a brigand is killed, they will not be prayed over. Not because they're not Muslims, but as a severe punishment for their retaliation against the state or against the lives of the Muslim people or people of the Islamic country, right? So as a punishment, they will not be prayed over, not because they're not Muslim, right? And so this is something to remember, right? And these were the ahkam of the shaheed. Babu Salat fil Kaaba. Now we'll talk about prayer inside uh, the Kaaba. الصلاة في الكعبة جائزة فرضها ونفلها. Prayer inside the Kaaba is valid, whether that be obligatory prayer or that be a nafil prayer, right? فإن صلى الإمام فيها بجماعة, and if the Imam prays inside with the congregation, فجعل بعضهم ظهره إلى ظهر الإمام, and some of them have their backs to the Imam. The Imam's back is to the back of some of the muqtadi'een, jaza. This kind of prayer is permissible, right? وَمَنْ جَعَلَ مِنْهُمْ وَجْهَهُ إِلَى وَجْهِ الْإِمَامِ jaza. And if you're standing in front of the Imam facing him, both your faces are towards each other, that is also permissible, even though it is makruh. وَمَنْ جَعَلَ ظَهْرَهُ إِلَى وَجْهِ الْإِمَامِ لَمْ تَجُزْ صَلَاتُهُ. And one who faces the Imam as such that he's standing in front of the Imam with his back towards the Imam, like the face of the Imam, and then that person's salah is not acceptable. As far as facing any direction within the Kaaba is concerned, because Kaaba is the Qibla, so you're literally standing inside of the Qibla, so wherever you face, your salah is acceptable. Except for in the last case of the congregation, in which your back is to the face of the Imam, because in this scenario, you're actually standing in front of the Imam, right? When someone has their backs to you, they're actually in front of you. And so in a congregation prayer, you cannot be in front of the Imam. And so that's why this person's salah will be invalid. In any other scenario, it's totally acceptable, right? Now, this is, you're literally inside that building. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant all of us the chance to actually go inside. The second is the kind of salah that we usually pray when we go to Masjid al-Haram. That is outside the actual building, around the thing, right? وَيَصَلَّ الْإِمَامِ فِي الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ تَحَلَّقَ النَّاسُ حَوْلِ الْكَعْبَةِ. So if the Imam prays in Masjid al-Haram, the people will form a circle around the Kaaba. وَصَلُّوا بِصَلَاةِ الْإِمَامِ, and they will to pray with the Imam. I followed him. فَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْهُمْ أَقْرَبْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَةِ مِنَ الْإِمَامِ جَازَتْ صَلَاتُهُ. So it's possible you might be more near to the Kaaba than the Imam himself. That is acceptable. إِذَا لَمْ يَكُنْ فِي جَانِبِ الْإِمَامِ. But you should not be at the same side of the Imam. So let's say the Imam is on like the north side of the building of the Kaaba, right? So if you're praying on the north side, then you cannot be in front of the Imam. You'll have to be behind him. But if you're praying on the east, west, or south side, you might be in front of the Imam. I, in the sense that you might be near to the Kaaba. Because on the other side, you're not actually in front of the Imam. So that is acceptable. Usually, the Imam stands like in the fourth or fifth saf. So if you're behind the Imam in his direction, you must be standing in the fifth or sixth, depending where he's standing. But if you're like on any other side, you might even be in the first row. That's totally acceptable. Because this concept of being forward in or in behind someone happens when you're in the same direction. If your directions are different, then being in front or behind someone doesn't make a lot of sense. وَمَنْ صَلَّى. Now this was when you're outside the building. Now we're going to talk about uh, if you're actually on the roof of the Kaaba. وَمَنْ صَلَّى عَلَى ظَهْرِ الْكَعْبَةِ. If someone's praying on the roof, جَازَتْ صَلَاتُهُ. According to us, his prayer is valid. According to Imam Shafi'i, he says that you're not actually facing the Qibla. You're not facing that building, so no, your salah is unacceptable. But what we say is it's not like that the Kaaba is just that small building, right? It's actually literally the building is just a representation. The Qibla is that direction. So like imagine that building and like stretch it up to the seventh sky. So that whole area in between is also part of the Kaaba. So that's why maybe even if you're in space, for example, or on a cliff on a really high mountain, you just have to face that direction. You don't have to bend like downwards in order to face the actual building. Just the direction suffices. So it's not just the building that's the Qibla, it's the entire direction. And that is why some of the fuqaha have the opinion that any masjid, right, in order to classify as a masjid, from top to bottom must be free of everything else. So like if you have another building, another room above the masjid that's not part of it, then that place can be a musalla, but it cannot be a masjid. For the fact that whenever something's a masjid, just like the Kaaba, it's a masjid till the seventh sky. And so you can't have something not part of the masjid covering that area above it. There's just one opinion, because if we keep to that, there'll be a lot of problems. We might not end up having a lot of masajid, especially in the West. So some Aima suggest a difference between the Kaaba and between other masajid. But some say that they're both the same, and so they make that uh, differentiation. But anyhow, according to us, if you pray on the roof of the Kaaba, your salah is very much acceptable. إلا أنه يكره, but it is not recommended that you do so. Because there's kind of tark al-taqdim. You're not actually giving it the respect that it deserves. And also, there's a hadith in Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah in which the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned 7 places where a person should not pray. And one of those things was فوق ظهر بيت الله, on top of the Baytullah, on the roof of Baytullah. So that's why it's makruh to do so, but if someone does pray, the prayer itself is acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that.